go. Okay, so before we get to the main lecture, okay, it loads up. There we go. So, just a reminder, the first exam is coming up, not immediately. It's not the beginning of next week, but it's the week following. And it covers the material from the beginning of the course through Wednesday's lecture of next week. So, some of you may be wondering where the dinosaurs are in this dinosaurs course. We're getting to the point where we're going to be wrapping up the background information that you need in order to make intelligent understandings of dinosaurs. So, we just finished up taxonomy. Today we start to look at evolution. That continues on to Monday, and we segue on Monday from evolution in general to the specific issue of phylogenetics, that is reconstructing the family tree, and that will take us through next Wednesday, and that'll be the last material that is actually on the first exam. And then a week from today, we won't get to dinosaurs, but we will set them up, because we're going to take a couple lectures to look at the world and the diversity of organisms prior to the rise of dinosaurs, and that means Wednesday after that, the first dinosaurs will show up, and then we spend the rest of the course on dinosaurs. A couple lectures, though, looking at some of their contemporaries, but pretty much dinos from then on. Speaking of them, there they are. Okay, so last time we were looking at taxonomy, both the human experience of taxonomy, the human endeavor to put names onto the diversity of life, but also the source of taxonomy, that is biological diversity, and specifically issues of what are species and maybe even what are genera. But we saw that what is a species, or rather the hypothesis that 2 individuals or 3 individuals or so are members of the same species, is a hypothesis. And that there are potentially multiple explanations for the difference between these individuals. So I'm going to begin today with what is essentially the end of looking at taxonomy, the sources of variation. So 2 individuals from the same population might look different from each other due to sexual dimorphism. Many, but by no means all, organisms, species, have distinctly different male and female forms. In some cases, it's extremely pronounced. In some cases, it's less so. And in some cases, there is no distinction. And in many cases, and in other parts of the tree of life, not so much vertebrates, but other parts of the tree of life, the distinction between male and female doesn't exist. And you have hermaphrodites, organisms with the sex organs of both as their normal operation. So when we find 2 fossils that look similar, but with some differences in a population, could the differences between them be due to sexual dimorphism? They certainly could. The question is demonstrating that. We'll come back to that actually issue in the 3rd section of the course of how we would even begin to test that. But we have to keep that in mind. On to genetic or growth variation. All organisms look different from birth or hatching to adulthood. In the case of something like a crab or other crustacean, it's profoundly different. Or say, think of a butterfly. It would be difficult, it would be nigh impossible to tell from an adult butterfly what its caterpillar looked like. But even among vertebrates, there can often be quite big differences, more than merely just size. I mean, we adult humans do not look like babies grown to, 5 to 6 or so feet tall. If we did, we'd have heads about that big and stumpy arms and legs. We would look fantastic and weird. So when you find individuals, say in fossil form, from the same formation, with some similarities, are you looking at different growth stages, or might it be due to them being different species? That's something we'll have to evaluate. Again, in the 3rd section of the course, we will talk about the means we might use to evaluate ontogenetic stages and the age of individuals. Geographic variation. I mentioned this with regard to other organisms in the last lecture. But we note that there can be geographic variation, regional variations in traits among what most people would recognize as the same species. So different wildebeest in different parts of Africa have some different characteristics. Many of these are soft tissue features, which wouldn't be preservable, but some include things like the shape of the horns, and that definitely would be preservable. So just because you have two different forms from different spots that are similar but somewhat different, are they actually different species, or are we just talking about geographic variation? This is something that's extremely difficult to assess for fossil record. Speaking of something from the fossil record, this is something that the folks who work in this building don't normally have to deal with, and that's stratigraphic variation. We see populations, or rather individuals, at different stratigraphic horizons can look different from each other. And are we seeing the same species, or is it different species? Or is that even a meaningful question? And we'll be getting to that one in this lecture. A slide I didn't put in here, but or rather a point I didn't put in here, but I'll just mention it, is taphonomic variation. And in that case, it's not actually real variation between the individuals as organisms, but rather as fossils, as entities as they're preserved. As you might imagine, most fossils are not pristine duplicates of what the original organism looked like. They've all been somewhat weathered. Some might be compressed medial-laterally, and other ones compressed dorso-ventrally, and they look different from each other. And there have been cases in the past where people, because they saw these differences and didn't appreciate the taphonomic filters, the preservational filters that they went through, and transformations, they thought they were different species until people pointed out, now look at that, just sort of retro-deform them, and they're pretty much identical. Okay, yeah. And then the big one of all, and that's what's going to segue into today's main topic, individual variation. One of the big discoveries in the 19th century, and people had actually known about this for all along, but they sort of recognized it as an important biological feature. An important discovery of the 19th century is that this is reality. No two individuals in a population are 100% identical, and that's normal. That's what things are. We know that obviously with humans. And we know that no two, even identical twins, there are little differences you can note between them. And of course, they're obviously different individuals. But it's true of all populations. And I know that the people who are into biological diversity as trophy collecting fail to appreciate that. They really want to typify, that is, to create types in a philosophical sense of each of the variation. In fact, normally there's some sort of gradual distribution among them. And the recognition of that attribute, and actually tying this attribute with these others, in the 19th century led to one of the greatest discoveries in the history of science. So, these last 2 points in particular point to something bigger, and that is the transformation of one species into another. In other words, we're finally getting to the topic of evolution. So, what we're seeing here, that's not actually evolution. At least it's not biological evolution as we normally think about it. People might, let's see, do I have it here? Yeah, okay. People might think about evolution in general as any sort of change through time. And you can certainly use it in that context. My colleagues in geology who work on igneous rocks, for instance, can talk about the evolution of a magma chamber. And that is the standard transformation as it cools down, sort of predictable changes given an initial mass of particular minerals or particular ions in a molten state, what's going to come out of it. In whichever building Astro is in, I guess the Atlantic building, when they talk about evolution of a star, they're talking about the change of stars through their life cycle, and that's normally determined by the mass of the initial formation of that star. Our friends over in art and sociology, the sociologists, or for that matter, the artists, or art historians at least, they can talk about the evolution of fashion. or the evolution of a particular art medium or something. And they're talking about change through time. Fine. But in biology, evolution means something much more specific. It's not any type of change through time. For instance, nothing in Pokemon evolves. There's no evolution in Pokemon. That's all ontogenetic variation. That's ontogeny. That's one individual transforming through growth stages. That ain't evolution. So what is evolution? Well, the word literally means unfolding or unraveling. So to revolve is to go around. To involve technically is to spiral inward. And so we use that. We involve someone, we pull them in, we spiral them in. And evolve is the opposite, to spiral outward. Prior to about the 1860s, in biology, when they talked about evolution, they didn't talk about species transformation through time. They were talking about embryological development, the unfolding of a fertilized egg through various developmental stages. Now, of course, as I said, we use it generally in the context of change through time. Now, many of my colleagues in this building with B-side courses might say that evolution is change in gene frequency in a population. Technically true. I can't object to that definition. But it's a little boring, and it misses the big point. Or rather, it obscures the point. Let's put it that way. It obscures the point. It's talking about a mechanism rather than the phenomenon. The phenomenon is descent with modification. That is, we are specifically addressing ancestors and descendants. Ultimately, parents and offspring, and their offspring, and their offspring, etc., etc., etc. And the fact that distant offspring do not look like their ancestors. By the way, the word ancestor has a specific meaning. An ancestor is not an early relative. Your uncle, your great-great-aunt, your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-uncle are not ancestors. They're early relatives. Your mom, your grandpa, your great-grandma are ancestors because you are in a direct line of parent and offspring from them. So that's the distinction between ancestor and descendant. In fact, this phrase, descent with modification, Charles Darwin used this phrase a lot more often than he used the word evolution. Because, of course, it had a different meaning in his era, although he was largely responsible for helping transform it to this meaning. And in books like The Origin, he tended to use descent with modification. Now, let's go back this one. So, to think about descent with... No, I'll get to that metaphor later on. I know a better point. Okay. Now, since ancient times, as far back, at least as the Babylonians, maybe back to the Egyptians, although honestly our knowledge of Egyptian natural history isn't as good as we'd like it to be, ancient Egyptian, because most of our records tend to be religious documents or their histories or things of that nature, or especially we know a lot about their rites of the dead, because those got preserved in their tombs and so forth. But at least in the age of the Babylonians, we knew that there were sort of these two modes of thought with regard to the diversity of life. One, by far the more common one, and in many ways the more reasonable one, is an idea of fixity, that the world and the species within them, as we see them now, are the way they've always been. And very pragmatically, this is what we observe. On the scale of human individuals, of human cultures, of human civilizations, that's pretty much true. The world doesn't change radically at these short time scales. And so even by the 1830s, and even by someone who knew well that the fossil record showed that there were creatures of the past that were different than today, still the thought that species were fixed was in the mindset of many people, including very well-educated people here. So Reverend William Whewell, who, by the way, is the person who, at least in English, coined the word scientist. Prior to that, it was typically natural philosopher or men of science. Part of it, he said, there weren't actually women doing science. And also he wanted to compare it to artists and so forth, so scientists. William Wool talks about species have a real existence in nature, and the transition from one to another does not exist. If so, though, why were there these earlier forms in the fossil record? What was their relationship to later forms? So a contemporary of them, John Herschel, a scientist and son of a very famous astronomer. If you ever studied the history of astronomy, his dad was quite an influential astronomer. John Herschel writes, "I allude to that mystery of mysteries, the replacement of extinct species to others." And he's writing to Charles Lyell, a contemporary geologist. And so people had recognized by this point, in these 1830s, that as you go further back in the geologic record, the species that inhabited any given time slice were different than the later ones. How do you explain that? Was each fossil world a separate creation? Did God, create a world of reptiles, decide he didn't like those, wipe them out, and create something new? That wasn't very satisfying to theologians. There wasn't real way scientifically to demonstrate that. Most people thought that was kind of a silly idea. Or maybe each fossil world we saw had to do with, that was the inhabitants of the world at that spot, and then a catastrophe cleared that area of the world clean, and migrants came in from another part, recolonized it, and that could show this pattern of change over time. So the thought experiment was, what would happen if Southeast Asia was devastated and all the bamboo and orangutans and peacocks and tigers get wiped out, and it gets colonized from Australasia? Then suddenly there'd be eucalyptus trees and kangaroos and koalas and so forth. If we looked at that from the distant future, that would look something like these transitions. But the problem is that would require that somewhere in the world we had representatives of all these different time slices. We don't see that. The world got well enough explored to show that's not the case. So some people suggested that maybe fossils represent the actual ancestors or other early relatives of later organisms, and that the relationships between the organisms of the different layers was literally a familial relationship. So what was this initial evidence that might be going on? Well, there were lots of things people looked at. Some people have noticed this as far back as, again, the time of the Babylonians, because I'll get back to when we talk about transmutationism, the fact that this was actually an ancient idea. It's just we had new information as time went by. One obvious thing is the existence, first of all, of homologous structures, the same basic structure, blueprint that different organisms had, and yet that those structures are modified in different ways for different functions. That is, they're adapted. So in the word adaptation, the central word element is apt. So think like aptitude, to be fit for something, to be good at something. Adapt means to be fit to or towards something. And here's a definition: any anatomical structure, behavior, or other trait that allows an organism to interact with this environment in a certain specific way. And so here we see, again, the standard human, cat, whale, bat, forelimb, all of them built on homologous structures, but adapted for different modes of life. Why would that be? If life didn't have a history, if every species was independently created or somehow else emerged into the universe, you wouldn't necessarily expect to take the same underlying architecture and move it in different ways. You could create it from scratch. Related to that, there were well-known vestigial structures, structures which are homologous to functional body parts in other organisms with reduced or no function in other forms. For instance, whales have pelvies. Whales have femora. And whales have a little bit of a tibia. But they don't emerge from the flesh. They're way stuck up inside the meat. The pelvies are no longer connected to to the vertebrae, why would they be there? If whales didn't have an ancestor that had functional hips and legs, why have them? The existence of a nested hierarchy for life was evidence for some people that life had a history. That is, people began to think that when we're seeing these patterns of groups within groups within groups within groups, we're looking at larger and larger and larger families, not family in the Linnaean sense, but larger collections of related individuals. Just as you and your immediate siblings are a small group, you add in you and your siblings and your cousins, so the descendants of your grandparents, that's a larger group. The descendants of your great-grandparents are an even larger group, and so forth. And in fact, Linnaeus did actually have a third volume in the Systema Natura. In Animalia, we still use many of the groups he came up with. In Plantae, we still use many of the groups he came up with, or at least the same basic structure. Mineralium, no. My colleagues in geology do not use a Linnaean system of minerals because it doesn't work. There aren't this deep nesting, because rocks don't have history in the same fashion that life does. As we saw last time, species tend to be distinct to a degree. I mean, field guides work. You can still pull out your field guide and typically identify a species of bird or mushroom or whatever it is you're looking at. But these groups have fuzzy boundaries. Hybridization exists. Geographic variation exists. Those ring species where we had the salamander with one extended population, they could interbreed almost all the way around, but not at one point. So they are distinct, but they aren't entirely separate. When we look in the fossil record, so many of these things I've talked about so far, people recognize this for hundreds of years. Many, in some cases, maybe thousands of years. This one is a more recent discovery with the fossil record. We can find fossil taxa, fossil organisms, that contain attributes that today are found in distinct groups. For instance, this creature on top, which has feathers, like a bird. It walks on its hind legs, like a bird. It has a three-toed foot, like a bird. It has teeth, unlike birds. It has individual tailbones, unlike birds. It has individual fingers ending in claws, unlike birds. Or we could see these fossils down here that show something intermediate in form between the fin of a modern fish and the forelimb of a modern land vertebrate. Why should that be? Why should we expect these sort of intermediate forms if life didn't have a history? But life did. What we're probably seeing is a document of that transition. When microscopes were good enough, people could look at embryos. And they could see that while late-stage embryos in most taxa are extremely different from each other, that as you get to the earlier stages of embryology, the distinctions became blurred. To the point, before the levels you see here, if I were to show you a very early stage embryo of a human, a lungfish, a starfish, and an acorn worm, none of us, me included, could possibly tell apart. It would be impossible. But every single one of us could tell that early stage embryo apart from the equivalent stage of a fruit fly, or a crab, or a clam, or an earthworm. Although those ones we couldn't tell apart from each other. Why should that be? The final products are radically different in all those forms. Why should there be these conserved patterns? Why is life not randomly distributed over the face of the planet? So, we could think about that mad scientist that you encountered when I talked about index fossils and index music. So he captures you again, throws you blindfolded, well, not blindfolded this time, into his teleporting time machine, but this time the time machine part isn't activated, it just teleports. And you fall out, and you look around you, and you see zebras and lions and giraffes and wildebeest. You're in Africa south of the Sahara. If I just said zebras, you could also be in Upper Marlboro right now. But as far as I know, they still haven't caught them. For those of you who don't know, there's a bunch of zebras running wild in PG County right now. So, yeah, seriously. I'm still waiting. I live in Upper Marlboro. I'm still waiting to hear zebra calls in the middle of the night. So, if you fell out and you saw prairie grass and bison and timber wolves and so forth, you'd know you're in North America. If you saw eucalyptus trees and kangaroos and wombats, you'd know you're in Australia. Why should that be? Why should life have these clusters of diversity? And finally, why does the principle of fossil succession even work? Going back to that idea that we see at different layers of time, different assemblages of organisms. And that in and of itself, we can almost ignore all those other points, but we don't want to. We can almost ignore all those other points. This is a document of the history of life. It doesn't tell us the connections, but it tells us that life has changed over time. Okay, I actually cut out the other slide that I used to have. I do want to point out that many people speculated on what they might call transmutationism. So before evolution was called evolution, it used to be called transmutationism. And that was the idea that species would transform from one sort into another. And there were people who speculated on this as far back as ancient Babylonians. But what they lacked is a knowledge of the fossil world, among other things. So they didn't have earlier forms of any modern creatures to relate to. So they had to connect known modern animals or plants coming from other known modern animals and plants. Additionally, they didn't have a good grasp as to the scale of Earth history. And so that prevented them from understanding the mechanism. So even as late as the time of Charles Darwin's granddad, Erasmus Darwin, who himself was a famous transmutationist, there was not a good way to understand how these changes occurred. And just as an aside, Charles's granddad, Erasmus, and colleagues of his, like Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, they thought that change happened over time, but that there had to be some inborn mechanism that drove those changes, and that creatures always changed from simple to complex over time. Because they didn't understand any other way it could happen. So they didn't have a good mechanism, even though they had those bullet points there that showed there was history. What was needed is people to explain how the mechanism of change worked. And these two individuals are largely responsible. Charles Darwin, who almost everyone here has heard of, I'm sure, and Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently discovered the same material. They overlapped in time. They actually knew each other. They even had a bit of similar background. They were both Britons who traveled the world, so they got to see the world outside. They were both phenomenal collectors of specimens, even from childhood. So they had first-hand evidence of the diversity of even closely related things. And they were working at a time when the geology was beginning to be pinned down. So this is after the discovery of the principle of fossil succession. This is after Charles Lyell has published his book on basically the uniformitarian approach of geology, that we can look at geologic change over time, and that time is vast. It's millions of years, not just thousands of years. And so they had this information in the background, plus one more important contribution I'll get to in a moment, that helped lead them to discover the mechanism. That primary mechanism is what we call natural selection. And I should point out, they both made their discoveries as young people. We tend to picture them as old bearded guys. And that's because that's when they lived long enough. They were into the era of photography. But they were making their discoveries as young people. Right. Darwin's voyage on the Beagle, his famous expedition around the world, he did right out of undergrad. Both of them independently came up with the same concept. And through an exchange of letters, Darwin found out that Wallace had made this independent discovery that Darwin had actually done a couple decades earlier, because they were a couple decades apart. And in sort of sometimes rare case of gentlemanliness, if you want to call it that, in science. They decided to have, or Darwin, Wallace was on the other side of the world, so he wasn't able to specifically say he wanted to do this. But it was decided that other people, Charles Lyell and Hooker, who was a botanist, friend of Darwin, would jointly present their work to say both of them discovered it independently, and this was their discovery of the mechanisms of natural selection. Now, subsequently, Darwin published his version of the book in 1850, or this idea in 1859. He had been sitting on it for a couple decades, actually, and this Wallace spurred him on to write the book, the famous On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Came out in 1859, has never been out of print. Wallace, when he came out with his equivalent book, called it Darwinism. So Wallace recognized Darwin got there first. But they are both co-discoverers. But what are the discoverers of? They made many of the same intellectual connections that were available to most people at the time, but people hadn't really tied it together. One of those, both of them started by looking not at natural systems, but at artificial systems, specifically agriculture, domestication. So when we think of these different vegetables here, we often forget they're the same plant. They're the same species. Broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage and kale, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, collard greens, same plant ancestrally, a wild mustard. Oh, mustard should be in there as well. Mustard greens. But what happened is gardeners would take plants that have an unusual feature, maybe it's the biggest crown of flowers, the tastiest leaf, and breed the ones with a similar trait and keep on doing so to emphasize those traits over time. And because human beings can artificially select which individuals are breeding and which ones aren't, and they can select what traits they're breeding for, you can extremely rapidly transform the biology of the descendants. It's not just true of plants, it's true of animals, domestic animals. There are not wild pugs running out there in the world. Pugs are wolves that have been transformed by humans. We have selected shorter-faced and shorter-faced and shorter-faced dogs, which are domestic wolves, over time. So, from a number of observations, Darwin and Wallace discovered natural selection. And these basic observations are these: variability, heritability, and a Victorian word, superfecundity. So what do those mean? Variation in all populations, some but not all variability is inherited, and more are born into a population than can possibly survive. Variability, heritability, superfecundity. Wouldn't it be cool if we had scientists on our coinage and our bill notes? We just have politicians and government officials for the most part. So, first one, variability. So I'm going to expand on each of those. Prior to Darwin and Wallace, biologists and people in general tended to think that there were ideal forms of each organism. Maybe, and this goes back to Plato and Aristotle and so forth. And they thought variation was a degeneration from that initial state. But Darwin and Wallace would say, look at human diversity, look at any organism diversity. They're always diverse. That's reality. It's true of people, it's true of pigeons, it's true of bombardier beetles, it's true of everything. Variation is reality. Individual variation is reality. Ideal forms are mere abstractions which have no biological meaning. They're metaphysics. We don't need it. They also noted that some, but not all, of the variability is heritable, is inherited, is passed down genetically. Well, okay, I used the word that they wouldn't have used. It was passed down. Certain traits are more likely to show up in descendants of someone than other things. So, things like, hair color, ear form, Lots of traits can get passed on from parent to offspring, even if that offspring were removed from the parents. So, for instance, the human ability to speak French is not heritable. A line of people who have only spoken French since modern French first appeared, you take their baby away from the hospital. Don't do this. This would be a horrible crime. You take their baby away from the hospital, take them to Japan, raise them as a Japanese kid. The kid's not going to speak French unless they learn it. Humans are, however, born with the trait of the ability to pick up the language around them. That is a heritable trait. And it's not just humans, and it's not just things like that. All types of features. Behavioral traits like homingness or pointing in dogs. Physiological traits, metabolic traits. In Darwin and Wallace's time, there was this big fad of pigeon fanciers who bred traits in different pigeons. And he went and talked with them and talked about their lineages of things, of pigeons, to understand the breeding traits. Now, the reason that some, but not all traits are passed on turns out to be genetic, and which is our phrase for coded in DNA. Darwin and Wallace lived before the discovery of DNA. Darwin lived to the discovery of genes, but didn't actually read the paper about that, although he had a copy of it. Supposedly there was a copy of Gregor Mendel's book, or a paper in his desk, but he hadn't opened it yet. Wallace did live long enough to understand a bit about genetics. Mendel's work got better known, but didn't live long enough to find out about DNA. But we know about DNA. So DNA is a molecule found in our cells that gives a set of instructions for building and operating bodies. Some people will talk about it being a blueprint, but that's not quite accurate. It's more of an assembly and operations manual. So there is no, you take my genome, which is the totality of my DNA, and go through that, and you will not find any code that codes for these particular hair. But what you will find is a set of instructions that says, while creating the embryonic Thomas R. Holtz Jr., when this part of the head is being laid down, basically, start creating hair follicles. What are those hair follicles? See these set of instructions. And this set of instructions will tell you the nature of those hair follicles, which will actually determine when they produce hair, its attributes, and so forth. Those instructions are genes. Genes is just our name for these instructions. Now, most genes have more than one version, more than one allele, we say. And the different versions have different end products. So different combinations of alleles, and we get, one allele from each parent, result in different traits. Anatomical structures, behaviors, biochemical processes, etc. So it's important to remember, it's not the traits that get transmitted directly from parent to offspring. It's the genes that get copied. Consequently, as a result, because each parent gives one of its two copies of each gene to its offspring, the offspring might wind up with a different combination of alleles than either parent. So, each combination of alleles might look different. It produces what we call different phenotype. Phenotype is an expressed form, so that the manifestation of these assembly and operations manual, what gets produced. So the offspring might resemble its mother in that trait. The waviness of my hair actually is very similar to what my mom had. It might resemble the father in some trait, or it might resemble neither. One of my brothers is really, really blonde, or at least was before we're in our 50s, we're grayish now, or gray. But he was very, very blonde before that. Neither of my parents were. But he managed to get the combination of alleles from the parent, from mom and dad, that produced blonde. And this is true for every single trait. And so as a result, each individual has some unique combination of alleles. And that means some unique phenotype. This is the reason for individual variation. So now we've gotten through the existence of variation and the heritability of that. Yes?
Are we going to be doing Punnett squares in this?
We will not be doing Punnett squares. Yes, exactly. But so some of you, and again, many of you have had some of this in BSci or biology classes before. But yeah, basic stuff there. But wait! Sometimes there are heritable changes in genetic code. We call these mutations. They might be the result of a copy error. You know, the mechanisms to copy down the DNA are good, but they're not 100%. And as a result, it might basically stutter, that is, duplicate a section, or it might delete, might skip over. The resulting product might be some new allele for an old gene, like maybe some sort of new hair color. Or, and this is particularly true of duplications, you might wind up having something that begins to code for something that didn't exist before. So a new, entirely new gene. Now, most mutations don't affect anything. There are parts of the genome that don't wind up manifesting in some fashion. Many will be detrimental, and quite frankly, the earlier in development they manifest, the more likely they are to cause the development to go haywire in a non-viable fashion. But every once in a while, you might result in a change which is beneficial to its possessor relative to the original condition in the environment it's in. Just to throw this out here, anyone here lactose tolerant? Right, go mutants. Lactose tolerance is a mutation in humans, or indeed in all mammals. Lactose intolerance is the normal state. It's the wild state. Because why on earth would a mammal, which drinks milk as a baby and eats other things as an adult, need to digest lactose as an adult? They're never going to encounter it. And so this mutation shows up, and it's only like tiny fraction detrimental because you're producing an enzyme your body's not using. So you can live with it. A tiny fraction of the population of any mammal is going to have lactose tolerance as an adult. But sometimes you're in an environment where it's beneficial, so we'll get to that. Finally, superfecundity. More are born into a population than can possibly survive, derived from the word of this guy, Thomas Malthus. Okay. So, Malthus was a great demographer, one of the first demographers, a scientist who studies the statistics of population. And he pointed out that throughout history, the ability to get resources, mostly farming in this context, increases over time, but the size of the population increases faster. And you wind up with a population excess. Oh, that disappeared too fast. That's just this population excess. So the population outstrips the resources. People will starve, or you'll get social catastrophe, and the population will be brought back down to the level it would be supported. Both Darwin and Wallace read the work of Malthus, and it was key for both of them. They have in their notes how important this was. And they noted that in the wild, resources might remain on average stable, but every species has the ability to produce more offspring than the environment could possibly survive. We can think of it with a cockroach or a clam or something that produces thousands or hundreds of thousands of offspring every year, or throughout their lifetime, not every year, but throughout their lifetime. That we can easily see how they could outstrip their resources. But even a pair of elephants, a pair of elephants could produce 12 offspring in their lifetime, but the world isn't covered with elephants. Because there's always limitation. Maybe not enough food, not enough space. If the population gets too high, you might get the spread of diseases. The predators might take you out. And so the environment will take you back down to a certain level. So tying these observations together, and I'm not going to do a British accent, Darwin, in the introduction to The Origin, says this: as many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive. And you don't need to write down the whole quote. I'll give a short form in a bit. And as consequently, there's a frequently occurring struggle for existence. The more are born than can survive, and so there's going to be competition. It follows that any being, if it vary, however, slightly in a manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. Not saying it's an absolute, just a chance. From the strong principle of inheritance, heritability, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. So let's say we are in a population of mammals, humans, where in a certain environment, say the colder regions of Eurasia, particularly Western Eurasia, where domestication of dairy animals has been around for a while, the ability to eat cheese over the harsh winters as an adult might mean that you survive those harsh winters. And the ability to not digest them that well means you're less likely to make it through the winter. Over time, that will filter out and favor those descendants of those mutants who could digest lactose relative to the background. And lactose tolerance tends to show up in environments where, for some reason, the ability to digest dairy products was beneficial for survival for the adults. So here's a rephrasing of this in sort of a more 20th century form. So natural selection is the differential survival and reproduction of variants in a population resulting in a net change of phenotype, that is form, of the descendants. So it's the differential survival. First of all, the trait allows you to survive better. And reproduction, it doesn't matter if you survive, but then don't pass on those genes. Of what? Of variance in the population, resulting in a net change of the phenotype of the descendants. So that's what natural selection is. Notice there's nothing in here that the descendant has to be more complex or anything like that. It's just that the variation happens to allow it to survive better. Let's give it a chance of surviving better in that environment. It might be that having a slower metabolism is better, during harsh times. It might be that being smaller is better. If there are predators out there looking for you and the little ones are getting away and the big ones are getting caught by the cat or whatever. So let's take a look at it this way. So the differential survival and reproduction of variants in the population resulting in a net change of phenotype. So let's say this is a frequency in the population, the percentage of the population of some trait. We'll say it's size. And let's say we're in ancient Africa, and we're proto-giraffes, looking something more like an okapi. If you've ever seen an okapi, it's sort of a horse-like mammal. It's a close relative of giraffes. The ancestral giraffes didn't have their long necks. But in this environment, most individuals are of average size. A handful were of small size. And they also, comparably small handful, were giant-sized. Well, the taller-necked ones, the longer ones, might be able to get resources, that is, leaves that nothing else was eating, as though the big mammal was eating, and had a higher frequency of survival than the little ones, which aren't getting that much food at all, and the middle ones, for which there's a lot of competition. So they might have leaves within their reach in principle, but so many are competing over it, there's not many available in reality. Over time, the frequency of tall creatures will be more common. The frequency of little ones will go away, and any mutation that continues in this trend will also do well. So that over time, the traits that we observe in that lineage have transformed. So that's what natural selection is. Or, another way of phrasing it, a paleontologist from the 20th century, Lee Van Dalen, mentioned this. I actually like this definition better, but you kind of have to work through the steps to get there. Natural selection is the control of development by ecology. So how the bodies are being constructed is controlled by, it's influenced by how the parents, how the ancestors are living in their environment. Consequently, evolution is not something you see directly from parent to offspring. That's just descent. if you had, me standing here, and if my mom was still around, and she had her hand on my shoulder, you could see a lot of similarities between us. But we're clearly the same species. And if you did that same with her mom, and my great-grandma, and so on, and went back 1,000 years, 10,000 years, they'd still just be people. They would look less similar to me over time, but they'd still just be people. But if you went 500,000 years, you would see that that ancestor with the hand on their daughter's shoulder and their mother's hand on their shoulder would be different from us. Still clearly similar to us, but different from us. But at that short level, it's always the same. You go back 2 million years, they'd be radically different from us. 200 million years, they'd be really radically different from us. But at any given time, it's only just parents and offspring. So, and this is the slide we're going to end up on. Going from left to right, can you point out the exact place that the color stops being blue and starts being red? Or becomes red? No. That's the way it is in evolution. There's never a case where you go from one generation to another, where a mother gives birth to a child of a different species. That's not how it works. It's a change that takes place over generations. There's not a missing link, it's a continuum. So the origin of the species is a process. It's not a moment. When we come back, we're going to look at some of the patterns of evolution, what patterns we see that play out on the evolutionary time scale, including the big one that will be important for this course, which is the interrelationships of organisms over time, reconstructing ancestors and descendants in a tree of life. So have a good weekend. See you guys later.